The blood left a dark trail on the snow. Each drop was a memory, a testament to the life John was leaving behind, one ragged breath at a time. The mountain air was thin and sharp, a blade in his lungs. Below him, in the valley shrouded by twilight, he could hear the distant barking of hounds and the faint shouts of men. They were his neighbors, the same men who had shared his table and drank his whiskey. Now they hunted him like a rabid wolf, their hearts filled with a righteousness he knew was a lie. His side was a mess of torn fabric and raw flesh where a bullet had ripped through him. The pain was a constant fire, a hot coal pressed against his ribs. He stumbled, his hand sinking deep into the unforgiving snow. The cold a brief shock against the fever that was beginning to cloud his mind. He was a rancher, not a fugitive. His hands were made for roping cattle and mending fences, not for clutching a bleeding wound as he fled into the desolate wilderness. The wind howled through the pines, a mournful song for a dying man. He had lost everything, his land, his name, his future. All of it was stolen on the word of a corrupt sheriff and the greed of men he once called friends. He pushed himself up, his legs trembling with exhaustion. He had to keep moving. To stop was to surrender to the cold and the dogs and the guns. He took another step, then another, the world swaying before his eyes. The trees became dark specters, their branches reaching for him like skeletal arms. He thought of his home, the warmth of the hearth, the smell of fresh bread. It was a world that no longer existed for him. The darkness was closing in, not just the darkness of the night, but a deeper, more permanent shadow. He fell again, this time his face hitting the snow. The cold was no longer a shock but a comfort, a gentle numbness that promised an end to the pain. As his consciousness faded, the last thing he saw was a pair of moccasins standing silently beside him, their wearer as still and watchful as the ancient mountains themselves. This was not just a story of a man's downfall. It was a story of the West itself, a place where justice was a mirage and survival was paid for in blood. It was a story that was never meant to be told, a forbidden chapter buried under layers of lies and silence. But nobody expected what was about to unfold, for in the harshest winter, the deadliest alliances are forged in the fires of shared vengeance. John's life had once been as open and peaceful as the sprawling valley where he had built his ranch. The land was his legacy, purchased with years of hard work and honest sweat. His cattle were healthy, his fences strong, and his reputation was that of a fair and decent man. The town of Redemption was a small, tight-knit community, where a man's word was his bond. John had believed in that bond. He had shared bread with these people, helped raise their barns, and mourned their losses. He never imagined that their faces, once warmed by friendship, could turn so cold with accusation. The trouble began subtly, like a sickness in the air. Sheriff Miller, a man with a hard face and eyes that never seemed to blink, had always looked at John's prosperity with a veiled envy. Miller was the law, but his justice was a commodity for sale, and he served the interests of those who could line his pockets. His closest associate was the town banker, a man named Thompson, whose soft hands and friendly smile concealed a heart rotted by greed. They saw John's land not as a home but as an asset, a prize waiting to be claimed. All they needed was a reason, a justification to tear him down. The opportunity came with the death of a drifter. The man was found near the edge of John's property, a single bullet in his back. It was a common enough tragedy in the West, a card game gone wrong or a dispute over a stolen horse. But Sheriff Miller saw something else. He saw a chance to seize power and wealth. He declared it a brutal crime, a cold-blooded act that stained the good name of their town. He needed a culprit, a scapegoat to deflect from the growing corruption that was poisoning Redemption from within. He chose John. The accusation was absurd, a fiction spun from whispers and lies. Miller claimed John had killed the man over a land dispute, a claim supported by forged documents produced by the banker Thompson. The townsfolk, already unsettled by hard times and whispers of lawlessness, were fertile ground for the seeds of suspicion. Miller fanned the flames of their fear, telling them that a killer walked among them, a man who would stop at nothing to protect his own greed. He spoke of justice, but his words were poison, turning neighbor against neighbor. John tried to fight the lies. He went to the town, looked his friends in the eye, and told them the truth. He saw doubt in some, but in most, he saw something far worse, a willingness to believe the worst. His pleas for reason were met with cold silence. The bond he had trusted was broken, shattered by fear and the persuasive power of a lie. The people he had helped now saw him as a threat, a stain on their community. They chose the sheriff's story over the evidence of their own experience. The betrayal culminated on a cold, moonless night. A posse, led by Sheriff Miller himself, rode out to John's ranch. He saw their torches from his window, a line of fireflies moving through the darkness. He recognized the silhouettes of the men on horseback. There was Peters, the blacksmith, whose children had played on John's land. There was Davies, the store owner, to whom John had extended credit when times were lean. They were not lawmen, they were his friends, and they were coming for him with rifles in their hands. He knew then that there would be no trial, no justice. There was only the verdict already passed in the court of public opinion, fueled by Miller's venom. He had to run. He grabbed his rifle, a few rounds of ammunition, and fled out the back, leaving behind the life he had built. He heard the splintering of his front door, the shouts of men storming into his home. A gunshot rang out, the bullet splintering the fence post beside his head. They were not there to arrest him. They were there to see him dead. He ran into the darkness of the foothills, the sounds of the posse echoing behind him. The life he had known was over, burned to the ground by a lie. His heart was a cold, heavy stone in his chest. It was not just his land they had taken, but his faith in the goodness of people. He was alone, a hunted man in a world that had turned against him. The betrayal was absolute, a wound deeper and more painful than any bullet could inflict. He didn't know it yet, but the man he was would die in those mountains, and a new one would be born, one forged in the crucible of loss and hardened by the promise of revenge. The secret of his survival would change everything, and his return would unleash a storm of violence that would wash the town of Redemption in blood. He ran for 2 days, fueled by adrenaline and a desperate will to live. The mountains were a brutal, unforgiving landscape. Jagged rocks tore at his clothes and flesh, and the thin air sawed at his lungs. The wound in his side was a constant, throbbing agony. He had managed to crudely bandage it with a strip of his shirt, but it was already festering, the heat of infection spreading through his body. He stumbled through dense forests and across icy streams, his mind a feverish haze of pain and exhaustion. The sounds of the posse had faded, but he knew they were still out there, scouring the wilderness for him. He was losing blood and strength at an alarming rate. He collapsed in a small clearing, the world spinning around him. The snow-dusted ground felt impossibly soft as he surrendered to the encroaching darkness. He thought this was the end, a quiet, lonely demise in the middle of nowhere. When he awoke, it was to the warmth of a fire and the smell of roasting meat. He was in a small, hidden cave, his wound cleaned and dressed with a poultice of herbs. A figure sat by the fire, his back to him, sharpening a knife with slow, deliberate strokes. The man was an Apache, his long black hair held back by a simple leather band. His face, when he finally turned, was a mask of hard lines and old sorrows. There was no kindness in his eyes, only a cold, appraising watchfulness. John tried to speak, but his throat was too dry. The Apache man wordlessly handed him a water skin. John drank greedily, the cool water a balm to his parched throat. The Apache's name was Nakai. He did not speak much at first, his silence as vast and intimidating as the mountains themselves. He tended to John's wounds with a practiced efficiency, his movements economical and precise. John was wary, his instincts screaming that this man was as dangerous as any member of the posse. But he was also his savior, the reason he was still alive. A fragile, unspoken truce formed between them in the confines of the small cave. Days bled into weeks. As John's strength slowly returned, the two men began to talk. John told his story, the words tumbling out of him in a torrent of anger and grief. He spoke of his ranch, the betrayal of his neighbors, and the corrupt sheriff who had orchestrated his ruin. As he spoke, he saw a flicker of something in Nakai's stoic gaze, a shared darkness, a familiar pain. Then it was Nakai's turn. His voice was low, each word laden with the weight of a tragedy that had defined his life. He told John of his own family, his wife and young son, who had lived in a small settlement that had a treaty with the very same town of Redemption. He spoke of Sheriff Miller, who had led a band of armed men on a raid, accusing the Apache of stealing cattle. It was a lie, a pretext for slaughter. Nakai had been away on a hunt, And when he returned, he found his village burned to the ground, his family and friends massacred. The ground was soaked in red stains, a mark of violence that could never be erased. Miller had stood over the bodies, his face impassive, his work done. Nakai had been hunting the sheriff ever since, a ghost in the mountains, a solitary instrument of vengeance. As their stories intertwined, a chilling realization dawned upon them. Their lives had been shattered by the same man. Sheriff Miller was the architect of both their miseries, a cancer that had spread its poison through the valley. They were two men from different worlds, a white rancher and an Apache outlaw, but they were bound together by a common enemy and a shared thirst for justice. A new purpose began to form in the ashes of their old lives. It was no longer just about survival for John or solitary vengeance for Nakai. It was about a reckoning. An alliance was forged in that hidden cave, not with handshakes and promises, but with a silent understanding, a shared glance that spoke of coming retribution. They would not just fight back. They would dismantle Miller's empire of corruption piece by piece. They would turn his own tactics against him, using fear and paranoia as their weapons. The hunted would become the hunters. Their first objective was to sow discord and fear. They started small, creating phantom sightings on the ridges overlooking Redemption. They would light fires that would vanish by morning, leave behind moccasin tracks that led to nowhere, and raid the sheriff's supply wagons, taking only enough to make it clear they were out there, watching and waiting. The whispers in town grew louder. The bounty on John's head felt less like an incentive and more like a death sentence for anyone foolish enough to try and collect it. Miller grew agitated, his confident swagger replaced by a nervous energy. He sent out patrols, but the mountains that had been John's prison were now his fortress. He knew the land, every trail, every cave, every ravine. Nakai moved through it like a spirit, silent and unseen. Together they were a formidable force. Their first real strike was an ambush. They learned of a patrol of two of Miller's most trusted deputies, men known for their cruelty, who were escorting a prisoner back to town. John and Nakai chose their ground carefully, a narrow canyon where the deputies would be exposed. They set a trap, a rock slide triggered by a single gunshot. The deputies were caught by surprise, their horses rearing in panic. Before they could react, Nakai was upon them, a blur of motion and flashing steel. John provided cover from above, his rifle steady. The confrontation was short and brutal. There was no honor in it, only a cold, efficient execution of a plan. They left the bodies where they fell, a stark message for the sheriff. The prisoner, a young man arrested on false charges, was set free, disappearing into the wilderness. Word of the ambush reached Redemption and sent a shockwave of fear through the community. The townsfolk realized that the man they had cast out was not just a fugitive. He was fighting back, and he was not alone. The story of the ghost Apache and the vengeful rancher began to take root, a dark legend growing in the shadows. Miller was enraged, but beneath his anger was a sliver of fear. He was no longer the hunter in control. He was a man with a target on his back, and the wilderness around him was alive with enemies. He knew then that this was not just a manhunt. It was a war. And it was a war he was in danger of losing. The lines had been drawn, and the conflict was escalating toward a brutal and bloody climax that would spare no one. The paranoia in Redemption thickened like dust in a windless saloon. Sheriff Miller, a man accustomed to being feared, now felt the unfamiliar prickle of being hunted. He doubled the guards, imposed a curfew, and saw betrayal in every shadow. The bounty he had placed on John's head now seemed like a foolish gesture, attracting foolhardy gunslingers who would ride into the mountains only to vanish without a trace. John and Nakai turned the bounty into a weapon. They let the hunters find their trail, a trail that always led to a well-laid trap. A deadfall of logs in a narrow pass, a concealed pit lined with sharpened stakes, an arrow from an unseen bow. The wilderness became a graveyard for greedy men, and the legend of the vengeful spirits of the mountains grew with each disappearance. Miller's authority began to crumble from the edges. He trusted no one. His deputies were jumpy, firing at shadows, their nerves frayed by the constant threat of an invisible enemy. The townsfolk, who had once supported him, now watched him with sullen, fearful eyes. They had been promised order, but Miller had brought them a private war, and the price was being paid in blood and fear. John and Nakai knew that to break Miller, they had to break his power base, and that meant targeting the banker, Thompson. The banker was the source of Miller's financial strength, laundering money from protection rackets and fraudulent land seizures. They watched the bank for weeks, learning the routines, the schedules of the guards, the timing of the gold shipments that moved under heavy guard to a railhead miles away. Their plan was audacious. They would not just steal a shipment, they would expose the corruption to the entire town. They learned of a large shipment of gold, the profits from a recent land grab, scheduled to leave Redemption at dawn. The night before, they moved. Nakai, using his knowledge of stealth, slipped into town under the cover of a moonless sky. He moved like a ghost through the back alleys, his target not the bank but Thompson's office above it. He broke in silently, not to steal but to acquire evidence. He found Thompson's private ledger, a detailed record of every illegal transaction, every bribe paid, every family ruined. It was the key to unlocking the entire conspiracy. Meanwhile, John created a diversion. He set a fire in a hay barn at the opposite end of town. The flames lit up the night sky, drawing the attention of the guards and the volunteer fire brigade. Panic erupted as men scrambled to fight the blaze. In the ensuing chaos, Nakai slipped back out of town, the ledger tucked safely away. Their primary mission was a success, but the night was not over. They used the confusion to their advantage, sabotaging the town's small telegraph office, cutting off all communication with the outside world. Redemption was now isolated, an island of fear in the vast wilderness. The next morning the gold shipment left as planned. Though the guards were on high alert after the night's events, they rode hard, wanting to put as much distance as possible between themselves and the troubled town. They rode straight into John and Nakai's trap. On a long, open stretch of road, a rope pulled taut across the path sent the lead horses tumbling. The wagon overturned, spilling armed guards onto the dusty ground. From the rocks above, John and Nakai opened fire. It was not a battle, it was a slaughter. The guards were outmaneuvered and overwhelmed. They fought with the desperation of cornered rats, but they were no match for the combined skills of the rancher and the Apache. The fight was over in minutes, the ground littered with the bodies of Miller's men. They took what they could from the shipment, not the gold, but the horses and weapons. They left the strongbox open, its contents scattered in the dust for anyone to see. But their most potent weapon was the ledger. They rode to the homesteads of the families who had been most recently cheated by Thompson and Miller. Under the cover of darkness, they left pages torn from the ledger, pages that detailed the fraud that had cost these families their land. The seeds of rebellion were sown. When the few surviving guards limped back to Redemption with news of the ambush, the town was already a powder keg. The families, armed with the truth, confronted the banker. Thompson, his face pale with terror, tried to deny it, but the evidence was undeniable. The crowd turned into a mob, their fear transmuting into rage. They dragged Thompson from the bank, his pleas for mercy lost in the roar of their anger. Sheriff Miller tried to intervene, but his authority was gone. The people he had ruled through fear now saw him as the cause of their suffering. A riot broke out in the streets of Redemption. The sheriff and his remaining deputies were forced to barricade themselves in the jailhouse, the mob outside baying for their blood. From a ridge overlooking the town, John and Nakai watched the chaos unfold. The fire they had started was no longer just in a barn. It was in the hearts of the people. They had turned the town against itself. The siege had begun, not with an invading army, but with the simple, brutal power of the truth. John felt a grim satisfaction, but it was tainted with something else. Looking at the smoke rising from the town, he saw not just the downfall of his enemies, but the destruction of a community. He was getting his revenge, but the cost was higher than he had ever imagined. The violence was escalating beyond his control, and he had to wonder if the man he was becoming was any better than the men he was hunting. The path to vengeance was a dark one, and he knew with a chilling certainty that it would end in a sea of blood. The town of Redemption was eating itself alive. For 2 days the mob laid siege to the jailhouse, their anger a raw primal force. Miller and his last few deputies were trapped inside, their supplies dwindling, their bravado evaporating with every passing hour. The town was lawless, a chaotic landscape of simmering violence and shifting allegiances. John and Nakai watched from the hills, their work having unleashed a beast they could not fully control. This was not the clean justice John had once envisioned. It was messy, brutal, and unpredictable. He saw faces in the mob that he recognized, men who had ridden with the posse to his ranch. Now they were screaming for the sheriff's head, their loyalty as fickle as the desert wind. He felt no sympathy for them, only a cold emptiness. The violence was taking its toll on him, chipping away at the man he used to be. The lines between justice and revenge had blurred into a single bloody purpose. Nakai was a silent, steady presence beside him. His quest was simpler, purer. He sought retribution for his murdered family, and the chaos below was merely the battlefield he had chosen. He saw no moral ambiguity, only a path to be walked to its inevitable, violent end. He understood what John was only beginning to learn, that in the West, fire was fought with fire, and blood was the only currency that truly mattered. They knew they could not wait for the town to tear itself apart. Miller was a cornered animal, and a cornered animal is at its most dangerous. They had to end it, to cut the head off the snake. Their plan was to use the chaos as cover, to infiltrate the town and take the fight directly to the sheriff. They would turn redemption into their hunting ground, using their knowledge of the terrain and their enemies' predictable panic to their advantage. They laid their traps during the third night of the siege. A tripwire connected to a precariously balanced stack of barrels near the saloon. A weakened support beam on the awning of the general store. A series of small concealed snares along the main street. They were turning the familiar architecture of the town into a weapon. Their final preparation was to create a breach. They packed a small explosive charge against the back wall of the jailhouse, a weak point they had identified during their reconnaissance. The blast would be their signal, the starting gun for the final act. As dawn broke on the third day, casting a pale, sickly light over the exhausted town, John and Nakai moved into position. The mob was still there, a weary but determined mass of angry citizens. The explosion rocked the town, sending a plume of dust and debris into the air. Panic erupted. The mob surged forward, thinking the jail was collapsing. Miller's deputies, their nerves shattered, opened fire into the crowd. It was a massacre. Men and women fell, their cries of anger turning to screams of pain. This was the moment Miller sealed his own fate. By firing on the very people he was sworn to protect, he had become the monster they all feared. In the chaos, John and Nakai slipped through the newly created hole in the jailhouse wall. The interior was a scene of pandemonium. Deputies were reloading frantically, their faces etched with terror. John and Nakai moved with deadly precision. 2 deputies went down before they even knew what was happening. One with an arrow in his throat, the other with a bullet in his chest. The fight devolved into a series of brutal, close-quarters confrontations. John moved through the building, his rifle a blur of motion, his mind narrowed to a single cold point of focus. He was no longer a rancher. He was an instrument of death. Nakai fought with a different kind of intensity. He was not just fighting deputies, he was fighting ghosts. He recognized one of the men as part of the raid on his village. A wave of pure, undiluted rage washed over him. He engaged the man in a ferocious struggle, their bodies crashing through a flimsy wooden table. It ended with the flash of Nakai's knife, a final brutal absolution for a long-held pain. John kicked open the door to the sheriff's office. Miller was there, alone, reloading his pistol. For a moment, the 2 men just looked at each other, the betrayer and the betrayed. There was no fear in Miller's eyes, only a deep, simmering hatred. He raised his pistol, but John was faster. His shot sent the gun spinning from Miller's hand. The fight was not a clean duel fought at 20 paces. It was a desperate, ugly brawl. They crashed over the sheriff's desk, their fists finding purchase on flesh and bone. Miller was strong, his body hardened by years of frontier violence. But John was fueled by a grief and rage that went deeper than muscle. He fought with the fury of a man who had nothing left to lose. He gained the upper hand, his hands closing around Miller's throat, squeezing the life from the man who had destroyed his world. But as he looked into Miller's bulging eyes, he saw not a monster, but a pathetic, grasping man. Killing him like this felt hollow, an empty victory. He released his grip, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He would not become this man. He would not be a murderer. But justice still demanded a price. As Miller gasped for air, a shot rang out from the doorway. The banker, Thompson, stood there, his face a mask of terror and desperation, a small derringer in his trembling hand. He had escaped the mob and had come to the jail, perhaps seeking protection, perhaps seeking to eliminate the last witness to his crimes. His shot was wild, not aimed at John, but at the chaos in general. But in the West, a stray bullet has no conscience. Nakai, having finished his own fight, had just entered the office behind John. The bullet caught him in the chest. He staggered, a look of surprise on his face before collapsing to the floor. A sudden, profound silence fell over the room, broken only by the sounds of the riot outside. John stared in disbelief at his fallen friend, the man who had saved his life, his brother in vengeance. A new, terrible rage, colder and deadlier than anything he had felt before, rose within him. He turned his gaze to the banker, and Thompson knew his life was over. The justice John delivered next was swift and absolute. The bloody resolution left a stain on the soul of redemption. John stood over the body of Sheriff Miller, not with a sense of triumph, but with a profound emptiness. His revenge was complete, but it had turned to ash in his mouth. He knelt beside Nakai, the man who had shown him how to survive, how to fight back. Nakai's breathing was shallow, a faint whisper of life fading with each passing moment. He looked at John, a flicker of understanding in his eyes. His war was over. He had avenged his family. A faint smile touched his lips before his eyes went still and vacant. The bond they had forged in the mountains was severed, another casualty of the town's corrosive greed. A deep, sorrowful silence enveloped John. He had won. He had cleared his name in blood and fire. But what was left? His home was gone. His friend was dead. And the man he had become was a stranger to him. The sounds of the riot outside had subsided, replaced by the crackle of burning buildings and the low moan of the wounded. The townsfolk had gotten their own form of justice, but they had also destroyed their own town in the process. John picked up his rifle, his movements slow and heavy like those of an old man. He walked out of the ruined jailhouse into the chaos of the main street. The people, their faces smudged with soot and blood, stared at him with a mixture of fear and awe. He was the ghost they had whispered about, the wronged man who had returned from the dead to deliver a terrible reckoning. They saw a hero in him, a savior who had freed them from a tyrant. But John saw only their betrayal. He saw the faces of the men who had ridden in the posse, their hands now stained with the blood of the very law they had once blindly followed. There was no redemption here, not for them and not for him. He didn't say a word. He just walked through the parting crowd, his eyes fixed on the horizon. He walked past the smoldering remains of the saloon, past the general store with its broken windows, past the bank that had been gutted by the mob. He didn't look back. There was nothing left for him in redemption. He was a man without a home, without a future. His justice had been done, but it was not clean. It was not righteous. It was a bloody, brutal thing that had consumed everyone it touched, including himself. He reached the edge of town and kept walking, heading back into the mountains that had once been his sanctuary. The sun was setting, casting long, dark shadows that looked like graves. The wounds on his body ached, but they were nothing compared to the wound in his soul. He had set out to reclaim his life, but had only succeeded in becoming a purveyor of death. The cost of his vengeance was his own humanity. He was a legend now, a story to be told around campfires, a warning to corrupt men everywhere. But the legend was a hollow thing. The reality was a lonely man walking into the wilderness, forever haunted by the faces of the dead. He had learned the hardest lesson the West had to teach. Justice is not a destination. It is a trail of bodies left behind in the dust. And in the end, all that remained was the silence and the blood on the earth. The town of redemption never recovered. It became a ghost town, a monument to greed and a failed reckoning. The survivors scattered, taking with them the story of the rancher who had brought hellfire down upon them. They spoke of him in hushed tones, a man who was both a demon and a saint, his name a curse and a prayer. John was never seen again. Some say he died of his wounds in the mountains, his body reclaimed by the wilderness he had made his home. Others say he wandered the frontier for the rest of his days, a solitary figure dispensing his own brand of harsh justice, his heart a cold, empty chasm. His legacy was not one of honor, but of fear. He became a dark fable, a reminder that betrayal breeds a violence that can consume everything, leaving only ashes behind. The true story, in all its brutal detail, was buried, another secret swallowed by the vast, unforgiving landscape. It taught a bitter lesson that echoed through the canyons and across the plains. In the West, all justice costs blood, and sometimes the price is everything you are. Historias del Oeste Prohibido.